Okay. Now, last week, we're studying Lamentations, which is 5 poems. Each chapter is a different poem, Hebrew poetry, which are laments or the mourning over the destruction of Jerusalem at the hands of the Babylonians in 587, 586 BC. And last week we were looking at chapter 1, and when we ended, we were looking at verse 9, which suggests that by its cataclysmic destruction, Jerusalem's uncleanness, which signifies its incompatibility with God. So Jerusalem's uncleanness had been exposed to the world through that public judgment. So now it was on view for everyone, its incompatibility with God. And as I said right at the end of the class, Jerusalem took no thought of her future, lived as though there would not be a day of reckoning. It's easy to put those things off, to not think ahead and to think about what God has said. And so it says here, it says she took no thought of her future. So never thinking there's going to be a day of reckoning, and therefore experience this horrific fall that she experienced. And her suffering is so great that at the end of verse 9, she calls on the Lord to behold it. That's what this is. "O Lord, behold my affliction, for the enemy has triumphed." This is an appeal for pity. It's just like, look at me. Look at the state I'm in. You see, to take pity on me. Now in verse 10 laments the plundering of the temple in Jerusalem by pagans. See, not even Israelites who were not priests could enter the temple. But the fury of God against Jerusalem was so great that he made her watch the temple be treated with the kind of disrespect toward him that they had exhibited. You see, so here's this holy thing. Only the priests can go in there. He makes them watch the temple be desecrated by pagans just as they had disrespected him. So he has them look at that and watch that. And then in addition to that mental anguish, verse 11 refers to the starvation the people of Jerusalem endured during the siege of the city and probably after. Because when you come in and have you have Judah taken over and destroyed, you have the city destroyed, all of the productivity, the supply chains, all of that are down. And so the starvation would occur not only during the siege, but almost certainly thereafter. And the people are there starving, and they groaned as they were forced to search for food. And they were so hungry that they would surrender their most prized possession in exchange for food to stay alive. Right? If you're starving to death, who cares if you want to eat. And so, it's this picture of what was going on in Jerusalem at that time. And then this verse ends with another cry to God to see the depths of her suffering. "Look, O Lord, and see, for I'm despised. Just look and have pity on me." In verse 12, Jerusalem calls on those passing by her ruins. So she's just this destroyed city. And she calls on those who are going by to take note of the magnitude of her sorrow. Recognize that. Recognize the magnitude of my sorrow that has been inflicted by the Lord on the day he fulfilled the promise of his judgment. You see what it says here, the Lord inflicted on the day of his fierce anger. What God, when he pulled the trigger of judgment, look at what he has done and how he has done that. In verse 13, says that God brought destruction on the city. He brought fire into its bones, and he spread a net to trap any who attempted to escape, thus turning them back into the fire. The city was demoralized. The city was left stunned and faint. And then in verse 14 states that God turned Jerusalem's transgressions into a yoke upon its neck. Okay, so this yoke is you put these yokes on animals to have them work for you. And what he's saying is that he judged their transgressions, and he did that by delivering the city to its enemy for exile. So they would then be captives of the Babylonians, working for the Babylonians. And he did that, you see, because of their rebellion against him. That's the judgment. And all of this, you know, I've said this before, but all of this, why is God giving us this picture? And it's such a blessing for us because he's allowing us to hear. It's like somebody coming back from the dead who then can tell us, oh, no, you don't want to go this way. You see, it's those who have experienced the horror of God's judgment. He's allowing them to speak to us. You see, as a warning that you don't want any part of this. Now, verse 15 says that God rejected Jerusalem's fighting men, meaning he chose for those fighting men to be defeated. He summoned an assembly, the Babylonian army, to crush those fighting men. Jerusalem was trodden as in a wine press, which, as Paul House says, quote, represents the crushed resistance and the defender's lifeblood shed like grapes crushed in a wine press. So this is a picture of Jerusalem. And in verse 16, Jerusalem sobs over her judgment. You know, I often say that comic in the New Yorker from many years ago, where you got that guy straightening his tie and is prepared to meet thy God. And he just kind of, you know, he's not going to be like that. You see, when judgment comes, you see how does God relay it to us? This sobbing. Just complete torment. Right? Suffering. And that's what he has here. Jerusalem sobs over her judgment. And there's no one to comfort her. You see, those who lived in the city, her children, the inhabitants of Jerusalem, they likewise are emotionally devastated because the enemy has prevailed against the city. So they're all experiencing this. And verse 17 expresses again that there's no one to help relieve Jerusalem's suffering. As part of her judgment, you see, she stands isolated and despised by other nations. That's part of the judgment now, that here you are so prideful. You are on top of everything. Now look at you. You worthless. What a joke. Just trying to rub their face in it. You see, that's it. Seen as just no one there, no one with them. And verse 18 confesses expressly, you see, that God is right to have brought this devastating judgment. We look at this and we say, oh, how could he be so harsh? That's why I went through all of that. Because our tendency is to see this and judge God, which is, of course, is insane. To think that you're in a position to judge the infinite God. But we do that. You know, people always criticizing, oh, God wouldn't. Why did he do this? Look, he's God. Your best role is to try to figure out why is he doing what he's doing. But don't sit in judgment. I'm saying, you know what? I think that's where God went wrong. You know, it's just absolutely crazy. But here, God is right for having brought this devastating judgment. And the inspired poet, he has Jerusalem declare, the Lord is in the right, for I have rebelled against his word. And rebel they did. And he was long-suffering and patient and pleading with them. And finally, the cup was full. And you see, we think it's easy, I say, to lapse into that, say, no, he will never bring the judgment. Look, all things go on as they always have. You see, there's not going to be a change. There's not going to be a time of judgment. And this is what the people in Jerusalem had fallen into. And you see that he judges them, and he does that. They rebelled against his word. But then the city calls all peoples, all nations, to recognize the magnitude of her suffering, which includes her young men and women having gone into captivity. Okay? They've been taken off to Babylonian captivity. And then verse 19 acknowledges that when she called to the nations in which she had trusted for safety. You see, human wisdom, we got our bases covered. We had made these alliances. Okay, so if things get heated up, you're going to come over here and help me. And you're going to come over here and help me, and that'll be good. So she acknowledges here, see, that when she called on these nations in which she had trusted for safety, they didn't respond. You see, contrary to what she had been led to believe. I called to my lovers, but they deceived me. You see, I was thinking that I had my bases covered and that when things got tough, I could appeal to them and I'd have it okay. Well, this is how it is. Right? They simply blew her off. That's why she calls to them and they didn't respond. And the situation in the city was so dire that the priest and the elders, you see, people you think that if someone had something to share, they would share it with the priests and the elders. You see, some of the people you think would be among the last to starve to death, but they starved to death while trying to find food to stay alive. Right, now that's a terrible picture. But it's exactly what God said to them. Do you think he's doing stand-up or something? When he's telling them, he's saying, listen to me. He sends prophet after prophet and says, listen to me. I'm telling you, if you continue doing this, the hammer's going to fall. And it's going to be a nightmare. And then he even spells out aspects of the nightmare. How he's going to bring the judgment. How devastating it will be. They just keep bopping along. They just keep bopping along. Verse 20 is another expression of suffering that's directed to God. You see, Jerusalem is in distress. Her stomach churns. Her heart is wrung within her because as she again confesses, I have been very rebellious. You have indeed. I have been very rebellious. If only you had heeded the many, many appeals to you, then you would have avoided this. Terror and death stalked the city. Inside the houses as well as in the streets, there is no safe haven. There's no place you can go for peace and relief from all the turmoil and the suffering and the hardship. Nowhere to hide. Right? Nowhere to hide. In verse 21, according to verse 21, Jerusalem's suffering has become well known. But the result of it becoming well known has been rejoicing over what God has done to her rather than comfort. And she notes that God had brought upon her the judgment that he had long promised. But he said it. He'd promised it. And she recognized that. And then she asks that he now bring her enemies to account. You see where it says, you have brought the day you announced. Now let them be as I am. You see, in this idea, verse 22 continues that appeal. Okay, I'm destroyed, but my enemies, now hold them up. Have a reckoning for them. And it reminds me of Habakkuk's second complaint. In Habakkuk chapter 1, verse 12 through chapter 2, verse 1. Where Habakkuk, he first wants to know how God can allow the evil that's going on in Judah to keep going. You're a righteous God. How in the world can you tolerate what is happening in Judah? And God tells him, look, you don't have to worry about this stuff. I'm raising up the Babylonians. And the Babylonians are to come and they're going to be my instrument of judgment against Judah. Well, now Habakkuk's got another question. He says, how can you use people who are more wicked than the ones they're judging? How in the world can do that? And God says, listen, you just leave all of this to me. Because after the Babylonians serve my purpose as an instrument of judgment on Judah, what you're crying for, I'll then take care of them. Okay? So this reminds me, this same appeal here, it reminds me of what you see in Habakkuk. Then in the second poem, the second lament in chapter 2, it begins with an exclamation of how God's anger had engulfed Jerusalem like a cloud. You see, his wrath is just everywhere. And the city, which was the splendor of Israel, Jerusalem was the exalted site of God's special presence, where the temple was. But God had cast it down from its glorious position. You see, he did not remember the city, or more specifically, he didn't remember the temple in the sense that he poured out his wrath upon it. This idea that God is going to never allow anything to happen to the temple. He will always guard it. No. You see, he's going to pour out his wrath against it, and he did. And verse 2 says that God showed no mercy to Judah when he brought his judgment. He poured it out just like he told them he would. He was faithful to what he said he would do. He swallowed up cities of Judah. He broke down the strongholds of Jerusalem, and he brought down in dishonor the kingdom of Judah and its rulers. That is what he did. And then the description of Judah's destruction, it continues in verse 3, that God cut down the might of Israel by withdrawing his protection and thus allowing them to be steamrolled by the Babylonians. You see, in his fierce anger, he has cut down in fierce anger all the might of Israel. He has withdrawn from them his right hand, his protection of them. That's how he cut them down. He withdraws that protection and just lets them get smoked. You see, he just lets them, he lets them get smoked. And he allows them to get steamrolled. He's consumed the nation like a fire, which is a very, powerful image of destruction and punishment. Verse 4 acknowledges that it was God. It was God who, through the instrumentality of the Babylonians, shot the arrows and killed people's loved ones. His fury burned against them like a fire. The Babylonians are his instruments, his agents. He is the one bringing it about, as he had told them. Verse 5 says that God became like an enemy in executing his judgment against them by means of the Babylonians. He swallowed up the nation and its palaces and destroyed all its strongholds. And his punishment, it resulted in great mourning and lamentation in Jerusalem. Sorrow, anguish. You see, that's the message of not listening to God. Well, how's it going to turn out? If I just blow God off and think, you know what? I think I'm God. I think I know best. I'm going to do what I want to do. I don't believe in him. I don't care. How's it going to turn out? Do we have any clue? I only wish God would have told me something. If only he had let me know. If only he had said something. You see? And that's why I think it's very important and it's very powerful. Verse 6 refers to the fact God's judgment included the destruction of the temple. See, his booth, his dwelling place, it was leveled and it was devoid of habitation, like a garden. And in doing that, Yahweh brought to an end the annual festivals and the Sabbath observances, which included burnt offerings that were made in the temple. So he brought those things to an end, and in his fierce indignation, God showed contempt for king and priest alike, expelling them from the city and sending them into exile. Oh no, he wouldn't do that to us. Away you go. See, just like he had said. And the point's reinforced in verse 7 that God disowned his altar. He disowned his sanctuary, delivering the temple into the hands of the Babylonians. Can you see what a shock this is for people? You remember when Jeremiah says, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord. You know, he turned it into a den of robbers, you see, thinking that, no, that's our safe haven. No matter how we live, no matter what we do, no matter how rebellious we are, we can retreat to the confines of Jerusalem, more specifically to his temple, and we can be sure that God will not allow anything to happen to that. Well, that's what he's telling them. You were wrong about that. You see, you were wrong, just as I told you. The sound of the pagan army celebrating in the Lord's temple. You see that he says, they raised the clamor in the house of the Lord as on the day of a festival. Now you put yourself in the position of being a Jew in Jerusalem with all the history and all of this about the temple, and then you hear the Babylonians in the temple partying. Oh, right? You see, you hear them there partying. That's absolutely, you see, that epitomizes God's judgment of Judah. Him allowing that to happen. Verse 8 emphasizes that it was the Lord who determined to destroy Jerusalem. You see, this wasn't simply an act of Babylonian imperialism. You know, where you always have these guys, they're out, we're conquering, taking land. This wasn't simply an act of Babylonian imperialism. God measured the city for calamity. And it was he who caused the city's defenses, the rampart, the embankment, and the wall on top, to grieve over their collapse. He's the one who caused that. And verse 9 says the gates of Jerusalem were broken and sunk in the ground. The city was bereft of kings and princes. Those surviving who weren't dead, they were in captivity. They weren't here in the city, and there's no law in the sense that there were no priests who were giving priestly instruction, who were instructing the people in the law. It's just a complete tearing up of the society. All that we'd known, all that had gone on, that's not taking place anymore. You see, and in the time referred to in the lament, whatever prophets were left in Jerusalem, they had no vision from the Lord to direct the people. So is God here with them saying, okay, here, I can do this, here's how you do it? No. They're just there. Right now, Jeremiah, recall that Jeremiah, he lived in Mizpah after Jerusalem's fall. You see that in Jeremiah chapter 40. And then he was later taken to Egypt after the murder of Gedaliah. So, but whoever's there in Jerusalem at this time, they have no word from the Lord to direct the people. Now, the tremendous grief of the remaining people, it's portrayed in verse 10. The elderly family leaders and the young virgins, every element of society, suffered God's wrath. Every element. The elders sit in silence among the rubble. You see, wearing sackcloth and sprinkling dust on their heads, which were common mourning practices in antiquity. No uncertainty what's going on. They're mourning. You know how painful it is when you lose people who are close to you. Your heart is ripped open. This is what's being pictured here. They're wearing sackcloth and sprinkling dust. The virgins bow their heads to the ground, overcome by grief and humiliation. This is to say, there's nothing here that's joyful. Why? Why are they experiencing that? They didn't have to. They didn't have to. They insisted that God judged them. Right? That's how I'd put it. They insisted that God judged them. Now, the poet's own grief is expressed in verse 11. He's cried until he can cry no more. Just cried himself out. His insides are churning. And he literally says that his liver is cast to the ground. Now, the liver was viewed as the seat of emotions. And that's why some English translations render it here heart. And the point seems to be that he is feeling as low as one can feel because of the destruction and the tremendous suffering that has gone with it. One example of that being that infants and babies faint in the streets from lack of food. Now, can you picture being here and seeing small children collapsing for the lack of food? Right? See, this is what he's painting for you, the anguish of it. How absolutely terrible it was. Why is he doing that? It's a word for us. You see, it's a word for us. He adds in verse 12 that the little ones cry out for sustenance as they collapse in the streets like wounded men and as they die in their mother's embrace. Like just an absolutely pitiful scene. Verse 13, it expresses the degree of Jerusalem's suffering by suggesting it's incomparable. Right? It's incomparable, it's unique. Her devastation, loss, her pain, her sorrow, they're beyond comprehension. And the ruin is so great, as vast as the sea, that she is beyond healing. Okay, certainly beyond healing through any human wisdom or effort. Right? There's no way this can be healed. There is a way. But no way that you can see. No way that you can bring about. Only through God can this take place. Now, verse 14 puts a large measure of blame for Jerusalem's suffering on the false prophets, okay, who presented as the Word of God reassuring lies about the people's relationship with God. You see, rather than exposing their sin, rather than exposing the people's sin, that they might then repent and be restored to God, these so-called prophets, they chose to be politically correct. See, to give the people what they wanted to hear rather than the truth that they needed to hear. And you see what's happening here. They are culpable because they had a responsibility. I don't care if you like me. You see, the prophet brings God's truth. And he does that to bless people, to be faithful to God because God is calling them. And when you distort and hide that truth because your culture and the people around you don't like it and you want to be liked, you are being unfaithful to your calling. You must tell people the truth. I don't care if they don't like it. You have to tell them the truth. Why? Because it is only the truth that will wake them up and have them come back to God. It is a horrible thing, in my view, to hide and sit here and say, to try to water down the Word of God, to make people who are living in sin feel comfortable. Why? I don't want them to think I'm a fundamentalist. Oh my, I don't want them to think that. I want them to think I'm pretty with it. I'm a bright, educated, reasonable guy. Right? This is what's happening. And you see how it plays out in the eyes of God. In verse 15, all those who pass by the devastated city, they mock and they ridicule her. And they ask, look, is this burned out pile of rubble? Is this pile of junk I'm looking at, is this possibly the great Jerusalem? Is it possibly the great Jerusalem, the city in which Judeans took such pride? You people always talking about, oh, Jerusalem, our city's great, our city's this and that. You're talking about this thing? Is this the city you're talking about, Judeans? Right? That's what's happening. That's what's being portrayed here. Verse 16, Jerusalem's enemies rail against her and celebrate her demise. They're dancing on her grave. They're not going, boy, you really had it rough. Really sorry that happened. No, wow! Just so happy that you got smoked because I absolutely hate you. Want to celebrate every pain you've endured. I just want to celebrate that, you see. Verse 17 again notes that all that happened to Jerusalem was according to what the Lord had promised long ago. I took you through those promises, not all of them, but more than you perhaps cared to hear. Okay, because I wanted you to see how clearly, how expressly, in detail, he told them, this is what will happen if you act this way. And then he was still long suffering with them. He was faithful to his word of judgment, which he executed through the instrumentality of the Babylonians. Verse 18 says, now there are translation issues with verse 18. Yours may read somewhat differently, but verse 18 says that the people cried to the Lord, but it obviously was too late, you see. There comes a point when the trigger gets pulled, when the cup is full, when judgment is coming. And that is what has happened. They have experienced the judgment. And that cup was filled and God's wrath was poured out without pity. Doesn't mean that he didn't want them to repent. He wanted them to repent. But when they absolutely steadfastly refused all of his appeals, then righteousness requires the outpouring of wrath in conformity with his promise. And that's what he did. And the poet then urges the city to pray with extraordinary sincerity and fervor, presumably in the hope of now stemming the suffering. You see, now stemming. Just look, there's only one way we can go. You see, the only way we can stem this suffering is by appeal to God. He is judging us. That's our only hope. And he continues in verse 19, urging Jerusalem to cry out in the night, to pour out her heart like water before the Lord, and to lift her hands to him for the lives of her remaining inhabitants, which includes the literal children among the group. Plead in sincerity to stem this suffering and to spare them. And in verse 20, Jerusalem, or maybe the poet himself, but Jerusalem calls on the Lord to respond to the depth of her suffering. She asks, who has ever been dealt with so severely? Noting that women had been and or were being reduced to eating their children, as God had warned, just as he told them in Leviticus 26:29, Deuteronomy 28:52-57. That was among the things he said. It's going to be so devastating. You're going to be reduced to eating your own children. Can you think of anything more nightmarish? Huh? Why are we hearing this? I've told you why we're hearing this. You have to take what God says seriously. As you live right here and now, it is so easy to ignore and say, just as it like in Peter, things go on now as they always have. They'll continue this way. The idea that there is going to be this change, you see, it's just so easy to fall into that. And we can't. We have to understand and listen to what God is saying to us. You see, You see, the priests and the prophets, they had been killed here. You see, they'd been killed in the temple. Presumably, they had fled there for refuge in the mistaken belief that God would protect them there. Right? So we have priests and prophets killed in the temple. Well, we'll go there. That'll be okay. No. No. See, he said, I'm smoking the place. Lock, stock, and barrel. You're not going to go hide somewhere. You're not going to be able to do that. You see, in verse 21, she adds the fact, young and old lie dead in the streets. And the young women and young men had been killed by the sword as God slaughtered the people without pity. Okay, so you can just picture this scene, like it's like this dystopian thing where you're wandering in some kind of futuristic city and you have everything, all these corpses lying in the street. Children, people. I mean, how does that, it's a killer to me. But you see the poet's imagery, what he's telling you. See, he's using all of his tools to help you see and feel. That's what he wants you to feel. What it's like to be on the wrong side of God's judgment. Feel that. See, viscerally, he wants you to feel that. She says in verse 22 that in the Babylonian assault, God had summoned to her a host of terrors. And on the day of his wrath, he had, speaking hyperbolically, as can be expected in poetry, he killed all who had grown up within her. You see, this is just saying, look, the way I'd put it, he simply just devastated and smoked the place. Right? So in poetic hyperbole, he just killed all of them. Right? But it's just still all in part in the same, keeping in the same thing with how devastating this is. We go to the third lament, chapter 3, and the poet establishes in verse 1 that he's speaking as a representative of those who suffered the wrath of God in Jerusalem's fall. See, he's the man. He's not a man. He's the man. He's a representative sufferer of God's judgment there in Jerusalem. He's the personification of those who suffered. And he says in verses 2 and 3 that God drove him into the darkness of despair, and he strikes him again and again the whole day long. There is no relief, no respite, no hiding, no safe space, no break. It is just constant anguish, mourning, suffering. You see? Oh, that's how he is. Verse 4 suggests he suffered the effects of starvation and the pain of broken bones. And he says in verses 5 and 6 that God surrounded and enveloped him in bitterness and hardship, that he made him dwell in an undesirable circumstance, in darkness. That's the picture, see, of an undesirable circumstance, in darkness, like those long dead had done. You see, they had for a long time existed in darkness. Sheol, which is the Hebrew term for the realm of the dead, it was often portrayed as a place of darkness. And that's why he's playing off this. He has made me dwell in this unpleasant circumstance, which he says in darkness, like the dead of long ago. See, who have been in Sheol, this place of darkness. And that's what he's talking about. This representative recipient of God's wrath, he stresses in verses 7 through 9 that there was no escape from his affliction. You see, God had walled him in. He'd bound him in heavy chains, and he'd put large stones in the path of any escape. You see, he's blocked him. He's put him in chains. He's bound him, put walls around him. As he cried out to God in his suffering, his prayer was blocked out. In other words, he's praying that this end, this season. God had said, listen, this is it. This is how it's going to be. Now, you reject me, and I'm telling you what you... So in that time, you see, well, I want you to change your mind. Go back on what you said. No, it's not happening. You see, it's not happening. Well, I think when I get to hell, I'll simply ask him to let me go. No, it's not going to happen that way. You see? It's not going to happen like that. Now, the experience of God's judgment was so horrific that he speaks of it metaphorically in verses 10 through 12 as God's having torn him to pieces like a bear or a lion. He destroyed him. You see, like just being ripped to pieces by a bear or lion, God pulled back his bow and targeted the arrow right at him. Okay, this is in a day of warfare and things where bows and arrows were, so it's clear. Who's doing it? God. God did that. And he says in verses 13 to 15 that God metaphorically emptied his quiver into his kidneys. And that as a humiliatingly vanquished Judean, he is the object of mocking and ridicule from people everywhere. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm not fond of being mocked and ridiculed. I really don't like it. You see, but that's what they're facing. Oh, you great Judean. You see, we've got God. God's going to take care of us. Well, how's that working out for you? Right? You absolute punk. How's that working out for you? Okay, so they have to face this. You see? And that's no small thing. To be treated that way and messed with like that. God has filled him with bitterness, and referring not to filling him with a bitter attitude, but to the bitter experience of the judgment. That's what he's talking about. It says a point he emphasizes by saying that God sated him with the bitter plant wormwood. He's like what he's brought on me. It's just such a bitter experience to endure. God has brought that on me in his judgment. Okay? More to say, it's not happy talk, but it's useful talk. Thanks for coming. Five, 4, 3, 2, 1. There you go. Good morning. And then today is a great day in history because it's Brother John's 75th birthday. And I tell, there we are in Dallas, Texas in 1955. I'm the chubby guy on the let's see, what's that? The left. And I'm wearing a cape. I don't know if you can see that. And John is holding a slide rule. See, he was a nerd even then. But I told him that if we're not careful, we're going to get old. I mean, 75. I mean, it's like crazy talk. But happy birthday, man! You're getting uglier by the minute. Now, Mary doesn't like it when I talk that way about him, but she knows it's true.